continuing to shake markets around the world, including here at home. So is there a broader economic impact of this conflict? And if so, how must South Africa deal with it? Let's discuss this now with Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg, this Patrick Bond. Professor, are you at UJ or Western Cape now? Sorry.
Yes, I just moved to UJ. It's great to be back in Johannesburg.
Yes, University of Johannesburg. Yeah, sorry, because I have something else written for me. Apologies for that. University of Johannesburg. Now, the sanctions have been intensified, so to speak, since you and I last spoke here on eNCA last week by the Western world against Russia. And we were even speculating at the time what would the impact be on the price of oil, gas, and so on. And yesterday I interviewed my colleague Devin Morgan of the Money Desk. He was talking about how the mining sector in South Africa might benefit as people are now placing their orders for minerals that they get from Russia, but they can also get from South Africa. They are now ordering from here. So there's a kind of a benefit there for us. Are things getting more complex? And will they get tougher for South Africa in this environment?
Well, things changed very quickly because even last night when there was hope that some talks could lead to a ceasefire, the talks broke down. You could see the price of gold, which is the traditional safe haven, moving up and down. And I think that's going to continue. That is, that it's a very volatile situation. We do know the price of oil has gone through the roof, and with that, other fossil fuels. So South Africa still benefits, tragically, I think, with the climate catastrophe, but we benefit from coal exports, roughly 70 million tons a year. And coal has been going up to record highs. Then there's the platinum group, as you say, because Russia is the #2 producer, but at only about 10% of the world reserves. We've had about 80%, but not quite that much in output. But now there will be more platinum output, the price already going up again. And that could lead to not just higher profits for the big mining houses, but more tax revenues to give perhaps some genuine relief to poor people if Enoch Godongwana recycles it. And then, of course, there's a general situation in which, let's say, the world's vulnerabilities, its Achilles heels, especially with supply chains having been so fragile. And that will continue to get worse. And finally, there's finance, with not just stock markets up and down, but also the world financial system's undergoing an experiment of sanctioning. It's happened once before with Iran when they were thrown out of the SWIFT international transactions. And now Russia being tossed out represents a major problem for anyone trying to trade. And South Africa does a fair bit of trade with Russia as well. So that may also be adversely affected.
Yeah, and things, the talks are underway. I don't know if they'll find a solution anytime soon. And at the same time, we're having a humanitarian crisis that's developing with much more than 500,000 people, families fleeing Ukraine, mostly women and children, because men are not allowed to leave. So on the back of that, you've got economic impact, then you've got a humanitarian impact. And these things can be intertwined because resources will have to be redirected towards humanitarian relief.
Well, that's right. But not only will humanitarian and refugee flows become critical, and South Africa's had one extraordinary group that travels the world, Gift of the Givers. Who knows, maybe they'll be called in to give support since they do that so well. But particularly, I think the figure of Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia takes on a sort of evil empire character, and the delegitimization of that Russian leader then also affects South Africa, because we've had such pros and cons, especially with Russia having in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa group, begun to revive the old Soviet era interest in this country. And that initially didn't look good because it involved the Guptas and their uranium, and Jacob Zuma's desire to have the company that produces nuclear energy. Rosatom builds 8 reactors here, and that was pushed back largely by progressives in, environmental and the religious community, and general disgust for what appeared to be another Gupta-related, bribery system. And I think that becomes something we look at later in the year, September, when China is expected to host the BRICS. Will the BRICS still exist with the kind of rifts that are anticipated if this conflict continues? Pretty much South Africa as a government with the West, even though the ANC and the Communist Party still have that affection for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and I mean, South Africa, according to Dr. Naledi Pandor, Prof, is deeply concerned, just to paraphrase what she had said about the escalation of the situation and still calling for both parties to use diplomacy and negotiations to resolve this. But a durable political and security outcome will be in the best interest of the global economy as well.
Oh, of course. And look, the dilemma about the global economy is we've had this extraordinary volatility. Probably it was worse about 2 years ago, just when the coronavirus was identified. And if you recall, in March and April of 2020, all the world stock markets collapsed. I mean, it was 40, 50% cuts. The money wasn't sort of lost, it was sloshing around. And very quickly, what world central banks did was push more money. They did the quantitative easing. So those stock markets have come back. And in our case, more than doubled, even though the economy has just come up a little bit since that time. And it's a really shocking indictment, I suspect, that we can't really generate more stability in the world in an era where we thought globalization would interrelate all of the world's companies, and this kind of, moronic bombing and occupation of a neighboring country would be considered impossible under a period of globalization where economic harmony depended upon political harmony. Well, it turned out that was just a bit of a story, a myth. And when the trade to GDP ratios have begun to fall, and that's not just with COVID, it goes back to 2008, the peaks. For example, South Africa, about 66% trade to GDP, now we're around 51%. And with deglobalization and with the kind of pressures on Vladimir Putin, that volatility in the world economy seems to be getting worse and worse. So I suspect we'll find those central banks returning. I mean, if you're in Russia, you're a central banker, you tighten interest rates, you put them up to 20% because your currency's just crashed 30%. So if you're in Russia right now, you've got a very, very serious economic crisis. The rich are trying to get their money out. But for the rest of us in the world economy, Dan, it's a very frightening period because we know that the central banks would be willing, as they showed 2 years ago and in 2009, to throw money at the problem. What they'd been doing the last few months was the opposite, to withdraw the quantitative easing and start to raise interest rates. So they'll have to do, quite a flip-flop to ensure we're not into another meltdown.
Will Lesisha Kganyago have to do what others might likely do to our interest rates? I mean, they have been now, they had said a gradual increase after the last month's 25 basis point increase to our rates. Should we expect that our Reserve Bank will follow suit, Prof?
Well, I hope so, and partly because the ordinary person in the street has been suffering from a very high debt-to-income ratio, and the non-performing loans, the impaired credit, all these kind of ways of measuring whether people are handling their debt, they don't look good. And as the Reserve Bank, as Lesisha Kganyago, has put the interest rate up, now it's 0.5% from its low point last year. That has increased the suffering and predictions of widespread defaults like 2008. Now, I think in general, we don't really have an inflation problem. We're lucky it's been below that 6% target. So let's hope that maybe the Reserve Bank will take another look at the world economy and say, it's time to loosen up again.
Okay, Prof. Bond, I can see your location says Kigali, Rwanda. And I just want you to answer this very briefly. In Rwanda, are they worried about this conflict?
Well, no, this where I am is a small prep conference for the climate summit held in Egypt, but it does raise the big problem that war, these military machines are not really within, let's say, emissions control. So the US Pentagon, the #1 emitter in the world, has never been told stop the emissions. And now with Russia, blowing up natural gas pipelines, blowing up the oil reserves that they're finding in Ukraine, it does show just how vulnerable we are when war and climate chaos, and of course, oil companies licking their lips because the price is up so high. We're very much in the wrong directions in all this. I think my colleagues, partly in the African Union, partly in UN processes here, are very quick to recognize.
It's a tough situation. Thanks for sharing those last insights there about why you are in Kigali, Rwanda, with that climate change thing. Everybody's also worried about the impact of this war between Russia and Ukraine on climate change in terms of emissions. Okay.